They didn't just send a few probes. The USSR launched 28 missions to Venus. 13 of them made it into the atmosphere, and 8 actually landed. This gave them a big advantage in space research at the time. NASA was doing its own thing mostly, with orbiting tech and satellites, not really exploring the surface of planets. Mars only became a big deal for NASA later. What's not as well known is that the Soviet space program was the first to send a probe into another planet's atmosphere. They also did a bunch of other cool things first. Soft landing on another planet, sending back pictures, and even audio recordings. It was like the US moon landing, but these Soviet missions are barely mentioned in history books. This is because the USSR was so secretive. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1992, the space agency was taken apart and then put back together under Russia as Roscosmos. A lot of important records and data from the Venera program were either destroyed or lost. And that's why we don't really know what the Soviets were trying to do on Venus. One thought is that they went to Venus because it was cheaper. It's not. That they thought it was habitable, but they were checking things like water, radiation, and the geology without the data they collected. We wouldn't know how crazy hot Venus is or how thick the atmosphere is. Today, most scientists think Venus is way too harsh for life. The surface is hot enough to melt lead. There's barely any water, and the pressure is super high. But this is a pretty recent discovery. Ignoring the USSR's work on Venus would be like rewriting history. The Soviets always thought Venus was worth it, even if it was just to beat the US in the space race. And while Mars seemed more likely to have life, it was way more expensive to get there. Venus is much closer, about 40 million km compared to Mars' 250 million. This meant missions were cheaper, which was important for a country that didn't have as much money as the US. Soviet missions often had problems. Had design flaws and communication issues. That's why they focused on Venus. It was closer, and they had a better chance of getting results. You can't tell the story of the Venera missions without talking about the space race. The USSR launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, the first satellite, which started the whole thing. NASA was focused on the moon, so the Soviets went for Venus. NASA actually had a hard time with Venus at first. They had what they called the Venus curse probes kept getting lost or breaking down as soon as they hit the atmosphere. The USSR took advantage of this and tried to dominate Venus exploration, especially since both countries were trying to win the space race. It became a strategic thing. The US took the moon, and the Soviets took Venus. The USSR kept sending missions to Venus to outdo the US, even though they had less money and bureaucratic problems. NASA tried to downplay Venus, calling it a wasteland while saying Mars was the future. This was the story in the media. But the Soviets didn't care about public opinion. They just wanted to prove they were better. The Venera program, even though it's mostly forgotten, was super advanced and ambitious. If any project started the modern space age, it was this one. Back in the 50s, Soviet engineers and scientists started building and testing early probe designs. Over the next 30 years, they improved them and sent a bunch of spacecraft to Venus, often under a lot of pressure. Despite these problems, the USSR had some advantages, like being able to carry heavier loads. This meant they could build and launch bigger spacecraft that could handle the trip. The Soviet science community was also working on math models too. Figure out the right flight paths and gravitational forces for landing. Their Mars missions were also coming along, but Venus was always the main goal. One of their big achievements was launching Venera 3 in 1966. The first thing made by humans to reach Venus and make contact with the surface. While US missions often failed, the USSR's program kept getting better, even with some setbacks. They kept sending probes that made it into Venus' thick atmosphere, and sometimes landed. One problem they had was that their spacecraft were small and not very advanced at first. But they fixed these problems, especially in the 70s when they started, using their best Venera models. They even launched 2 at once with Venera 4 and Venera 5. This decade is seen by a lot of historians as the best time for planetary science. NASA tried to copy these complex launches, but the USSR had already figured it out. The reason for launching to spacecraft was to get more accurate data. By launching two similar probes that were set up a little differently, the Soviets wanted to get data from different layers of the atmosphere and the surface. Venera 4 studied the planet and entered the atmosphere, and Venera 5 followed with upgrades to collect even more details. These probes were made to handle Venus' extreme heat, pressure, and radiation. By the mid-70s, the program was even more advanced. Everything about the Venera design, from the insulation to the communication systems, was being improved. Each successful mission, the USSR understood Venus better than anyone else. The most famous launch was probably Venera 7, which was the first probe to send back data from the surface of another planet. The Soviets had already confirmed how crazy the conditions were on Venus, and now they were recording audio. In the 80s, the Venera program was at its best technically. Venera 13 took the first color panoramic photos of Venus. Venera 14, a twin probe, was also sent to collect similar data. Since the Soviet Union was one of the first to explore Venus, Roscosmos, Russia's space agency, is interested in Venus missions again. They're working with NASA on a mission called Venerati, which might launch in the late 2020s or early 2030s. This mission will use new instruments to study the atmosphere, looking for signs of life. It will probably include an orbiter, a lander, and maybe even an inflatable probe to study the clouds. The Venera missions are important for more than just science and politics. Started during the Cold War, these missions show how creative humans can be and how much we want to learn. Even with huge technical, financial, and political problems, Soviet scientists kept going. Their use of robots to study the climate and terrain laid the foundation for planetary science as we know it. They learned a lot about Venus's crazy climate, including the crushing pressure, extreme heat, and an atmosphere full of carbon dioxide and sulfuric acid. The advances they made also helped with other space missions. Breakthroughs in heat shields, communication systems, and landing gear were used on later missions to places like Mars. Even today, the ideas from the Venera program influence how we design aerospace technology. These missions were also a big deal socially and politically. Every Venera launch was a demonstration of technology and a competition of ideologies. When Venera 7 landed in 1970 and sent back data, it showed that the USSR could overcome crazy environmental challenges. Besides science tools, the probes also had cameras that took the first close-up pictures of Venus's surface. These pictures showed rough landscapes with volcanoes and rocks, helping scientists figure out how the planet changed over time later. Missions, like Venera 13 and 14, continued this work, teaching us more about Venus terrain and minerals. Of course, the Venera program had its problems. Several missions didn't make it to Venus or had system failures that stopped them from sending data. The hostile conditions, like temperatures over 450 degrees Celsius, 842 degrees Fahrenheit, and clouds of sulfuric acid, made it super hard for the spacecraft to last. Still, the Soviet scientists kept pushing, and their work continues today as space agencies like NASA plan for future Venus explorations. One idea is the Vidyas mission, a joint project between Roscosmos and NASA. Building on the Venera missions, Vidyas wants to study Venus more thoroughly, looking at its atmosphere, geology, and potential for life. As we look forward to this next part of Venus exploration, it's important to remember the Soviet scientists and engineers who dared to explore a planet that everyone thought was too hostile. Their work set the stage for all future Venus missions and changed how we see what's possible beyond. Now, NASA is encouraging scientists to focus on Venus. This comes after a cool discovery hinting at possible life there. Looking back at NASA's old papers from the 60s, they used to talk about Venus really negatively, like it was a planetary hell, but Mars slowly became the go-to for space trips. This shift in focus wasn't random. Back when the space race was in full swing, the Soviet Union was throwing tons of money at sending spacecraft to Venus, even though it's a tough place with not much chance for life. The Soviets stuck with their Venera program until the USSR fell apart. Thanks to people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, we get why they did it. We're going to check out some newly released photos of Venus taken by the Soviets. When the USSR broke up, it wasn't just politics that changed. Lots of secrets got buried too. The Soviets were known for being secretive from their spy agencies. 2. Hiding possible alien stuff. Before the US took over planetary exploration, Soviets were the main players. The USSR put most of its efforts into Venus, even though it's a pretty awful place. In Russian, Venus is Venera, which is where the name of their mission series came from. This ran for over 20 years, from 1961 to 1983. At the same time, the US was busy with the moon, so the Soviets went for another target. Their interest in Venus wasn't totally crazy. Maybe they thought they could use it as a military base, or even colonize it after finding aliens. Because this was during the Cold War, the USSR kept their goals for the Venus mission secret. Now, all we know comes from files that have been declassified, and even those don't tell the whole story. What were the Soviets looking for, and did they find anything big on Venus? They didn't just try a few times. The USSR sent 28 missions to Venus. 13 probes got into the atmosphere, and 8 landed successfully. This gave the USSR a big advantage in space research back then. NASA was also making progress, but they were more into orbiting tech and satellites, not exploring planets. NASA didn't really focus on Mars until later. What's not as well known is that the Soviet space program was the first to send a probe into the atmosphere of another world. They also had other firsts in space, like the first soft landing on another planet and the first images and audio from its surface. These were huge achievements, just like the US moon landing. But these Soviet missions don't get much attention in mainstream space stories. This is mostly because the USSR was so secretive. When the Soviet Union ended in 1992, the space agency was shut down and then rebuilt as Roscosmos under Russia. A lot of important records from the Venera program were either destroyed or lost, which is why we don't really know why the USSR was so focused on Venus. But it makes sense that the Soviets chose Venus because it was cheaper. It's not that they thought Venus was habitable, but they were checking out things like water, radiation, and geology. Without the data from these missions, we wouldn't know how hot and dense Venus is today. A lot of astronomers now think Venus is too harsh for life. The surface is hot enough to melt lead. There's almost no water. The pressure's way higher than on Earth. But these ideas are pretty new. Ignoring the USSR's contributions to Venus research would be like rewriting history. From the Soviet point of view, Venus was always worth it. Even if it was just to show they were winning the space race. Mars, which is more likely to have life, wasn't off the table, but it cost a lot more to get there. Venus is much closer to Earth than Mars. The average distance to Venus is about 40 million kilometers, compared to 250 million for Mars. This made missions a lot cheaper, which was a big deal for a country that didn't have as much money as the US. Soviet missions often had problems. A lot of their spacecraft had design flaws and communication issues. That's why they focused on Venus, a closer target with a better chance of success. Leaving out the space race also misses a big part of the Venera story. Remember, the USSR launched Sputnik 1 in 1957? The first satellite ever, which started the competition between the two superpowers? While NASA was focused on the moon, the Soviets went for Venus. Interestingly, NASA's early attempts to explore Venus kept failing. It got stuck in what was called the Venus curse. Probes were lost or broke down as soon as they hit the atmosphere. The USSR took this chance to push even harder on Venus, since both countries were trying to win the space race. The US took the moon, and the Soviets took Venus. The USSR's focus on Venus was a way to outshine the US in space. Even with limited money and government problems, the Soviet Union sent more missions to Venus than any other country. Kana responded by saying Venus was just a hot wasteland, while promoting Mars as the future. This was pushed in the media, where Venus was made out to be bad and Mars was celebrated. But for the Soviets, it wasn't about public opinion. It was about proving they were better. The Venera program, though mostly forgotten now, was a super complex project. If there's one project that started the modern space age, it's these missions. Back in the 50s, Soviet engineers started building early probe designs. Over the next 30 years, they improved their models and sent a bunch of spacecraft to Venus. Often under pressure, despite all this, the USSR had some early advantages like being able to carry bigger payloads. This meant they could build and launch heavier spacecraft that could handle long trips. Soviet scientists were also working on math models to figure out the right flight paths and gravity for landings. Their Mars missions were also going well, but Venus was the main goal.